You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia and Catula, the Eddy Foundation, and listeners like you. If you love the work Rewilding is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast while you're there.
This is John Davis of Rewilding Earth with my good friend and close colleague Jamie Phillips in Splitrock Wildway with another podcast as part of our Wildways and their Champions series. I'm going to ask Jamie, with whom I've been working for more than 2 decades, about what inspired him to get involved in, not just get involved in, but take a leadership role in helping protect and expand Splitrock Wildway, which is a wildlife corridor in the eastern Adirondacks, linking Lake Champlain and its valley with the high peaks to the west. Jamie and other colleagues and I have been working together for more than 20 years now to piece together this important wildlife corridor, very rich in wildlife, particularly in plant species. And Jamie is with me right now on some land protected by Eddy Foundation. Jamie's the founder and president of Eddy Foundation. This is some land that he and his foundation have helped protect. So, Jamie, welcome to the Wildways and their Champions podcast series. Thank you for being here. Thank you even more for all the great land conservation work you've done through the years. You've helped piece together more than 3,000 acres of protected lands. Most of those deals you've done yourself. And I want to hear a little bit, and our listeners want to hear a little bit about what inspires you to take a lead role here in Splitrock Wildway, and now increasingly also out in Southern California in Santa Margarita Wildway. What inspires you about these wild places, wild corridors?
So, yeah, it doesn't feel like there's anything in particular other than it's just damn compelling. I think when one looks at, and I suppose when I was contemplating what to do with some assets I had to manage for my family trust, the idea of putting it into Wall Street, to me, even as I started doing socially responsible investing, it's still, I really felt like part of the problem, that we have then in the 20th century, now and again in the 21st century, just taking wild nature for granted and assuming it was always going to be there. And yet, as I spent time out in wild nature, out in older forests and so on, that was so inspiring to me compared to anything that I would invest in Wall Street. It just, there was no comparison. If you look at the interest I would get on a CD at a bank compared to the interest I got with the same amount of money buying a chunk of land. It was like, are you kidding? And then looking at, if I think I identified land conservation as really something that was inspiring to me, and then what about that? Where would I invest? And I happened to stumble upon John Davis at a meeting of conservation people, and we got to talking, and John being very knowledgeable relative to what was happening with conservation globally, actually. And John directed me up to the Adirondacks as a beautiful place to look at investing, and then in delving more into the Adirondacks and in spending more time with John, the idea of corridors and wildways came into focus, and how important they were, just in where land has been so usurped for human purposes and the needs of wildlife ignored, that corridors were indeed, in a way, the low-hanging fruit, the land that needed to be protected first and foremost to sustain wildlife. So then it became very apparent. Of course, that's true, and that's where Splitrock Wildway started to come into focus for us and really take on a character of its own.
Jamie, you're extraordinary for your generosity, and I don't know many other people who have been so generous with their wealth. To be perfectly blunt about it, your wealth is modest compared to that of many Americans, and yet you've given most of it away. Most of your family's wealth has gone into conservation. That's rare, not just a tithe, but most, and that's very rare. I had the privilege, as you know, of working with Doug and Chris Tompkins for many years, and they are another wealthy team, very powerful team that has helped protect more than 2 million acres in South America, and they likewise have given most of their wealth to conservation. What do you say when you're with peers, economic peers, about how you find satisfaction from investing your family's wealth in wildlife habitat conservation? How might you inspire others to similar levels of generosity?
So, just backtrack a little bit on what you said. You mixed, to me, the terms being generous. I never thought of myself as being generous in the least. And I certainly haven't felt I've been giving my money away. It was definitely, I held it as an investment, but it's certainly a prudent investment. The idea, I may not be getting a monthly check for a forest that I was able to buy, but I've always felt it was an investment in a sense that I could some way get my money back from it. It felt like a long-term investment. Back when I first started doing it, it was the idea of selling carbon credits was always there. The idea of if I bought 200 acres, I could always parcel off 10 acres and sell that for a building lot, but protect, the other, portion of it. And I had the opportunity to work with a land trust in California who was doing that. They were buying property and subdividing, selling off a small portion, but protecting the rest of it and breaking even or even making money on it.
So for you, it has been both philanthropy and sensible investing.
But it is, maybe now it looks more like philanthropy. And I think if I'm just remembering even looking the word philanthropy up, and I think it has to do with helping people out.
Yeah, it does actually.
So to me, I'm more thrilled about helping trees out than people. This hasn't ever been about people.
Right. As you know, Tom Butler and you and I all use that term Wildlands Philanthropy, and Tom did that beautiful book called Wildlands Philanthropy, which is, in a way, it's an odd pairing of words because philos is love and thropy comes from the term for humans, but it's an accepted term these days, Wildlands Philanthropy. And you're damn good as a Wildlands Philanthropist, if I may say so. It seems like it's a blend then maybe charity is not the right word, maybe philanthropy is not the right word, but it's a blend of doing good and actually managing assets well. Is that fair to you?
To me, it would be a prudent investment. Certainly one way of looking at it, but we could just call it a conservation investment, more than wildlands philanthropy. It's wildlands investing. And the payback that I get certainly is the potential for a future of getting trading the forest land for an economic amount. But for right now, I don't need the income from a forest, and so it just feels like a wonderful thing to depository, if you will, for assets that, I guess I earned from working in the U.S. economy, and that to a degree my parents did as well, mostly from extractive endeavors, one way or another. So this is like a payback to me, not necessarily a payback, but it's reappropriating money that has been earned, in this capitalist economy.
I might jump in here, Jamie, for listeners who don't know your background. You were a very successful fashion photographer in New York City, and your father did very well in business selling fencing. Is that correct?
He originally owned a furniture factory in Michigan that he inherited from his father, and they cut down a lot of white pines for furniture. But then he cut down many, many more cedar trees, I think, in northern Minnesota for a lot of stockade fencing. So I think he was probably one of the major stockade fence distributors in the country.
So I think I remember you saying many, many years ago that to some degree you felt like your forest saving efforts were doing a bit of penance for the...
it does seem kind of obvious that one could say that. So yeah, I won't deny that. Although it wasn't, a planned thing to, for penance or repentance.
Jamie, I want you to say a little bit about your good work in Southern California, again with Eddy Foundation, particularly in Santa Margarita Wildway, and also say a little bit about your, and I guess I should say here our, because I'm lucky enough to serve on your board of directors, so I'll say our investments in conservation land in Dominican Republic. So Jamie, first, what is Santa Margarita Wildway and what inspires you about it?
So I certainly think that the concept of Wildway, to me, is in general very compelling. It's something you can look at on a map and you can just see pretty much a corridor, a pathway that animals can go from one kind of larger protected area to another, more or less connecting islands, if you will. And somehow it seems, I've noticed humans, but me especially, I love walking on trails, and it just seems a very natural thing to pursue. So, wildlife, same thing. So looking at, my parents bought property down in Southern California, and they bought, just quickly, they bought it on in a small development kind of out, up off a river, the Santa Margarita River. And when they bought the community, it was called Edgewater. But they weren't really near. They were maybe 15 minutes walk from the river. But so my father thought he was buying land on what was going to be a dammed reservoir from this river, and evidently, gosh, a Bell's vireo or a bird that was...
At least Bell's vireo, maybe.
Okay, perhaps, yeah, that was an endangered species, and some of its prime habitat was Southern California, so sure enough, the Endangered Species Act came into play, and they were not able to build the dam, hence Dad owned property up in the highlands, way up above the river. But fortunately, the town, municipality had to purchase all of this land along the river that was going to be flooded, and as it turned out, the river was a corridor that mountain lions had been using, forever. I mean, it was an intact corridor. And however, just after Mom and Dad bought a house there in 1980, there was an interstate that was built that basically severed, went across the river and really severed the corridor for mountain lions. So there were bodies of mountain lions that were isolated from each other, and they couldn't migrate back and forth. So the one island down in, actually not far from Los Angeles, the Santa Ana Mountains have a pride of lions there. And pride is the right word, but certainly a colony of mountain lions that used to have to migrate over to the Palomar Mountain Range and beyond. So it was, wow, that just got severed, and there were some groups that were trying to monitor the mountain lions that were trying to cross the freeway, and they would be getting killed on this very busy freeway. So very, even more compelling to look at the importance of connectivity and using that term Wildway that John and I think Tom and some others really have brought into the forefront.
So, yeah, actually a little background there, just as an aside. I think I was the first to use the term Wildway in public. Dave Foreman was the one who coined the term rewilding, and then we here in Splitrock Wildway were, as far as I know, anyway, the first to apply it to a specific place. So the first named Wildway in the country, I think, is Splitrock Wildway. And I think you and Tom Butler and Gary Randorf and I agreed to start calling it that after you helped expand our vision. As you know, until Eddy Foundation came along, we thought we'd be protecting a wildlife corridor going from the lake to Coon Mountain, and we didn't dare think beyond that, and you helped expand our vision, and we've gone well beyond Coon Mountain, much farther.
It was originally about a mile corridor.
Yeah, so you've tripled our vision in 2 decades, which is wonderful. But back to the cougars, mountain lions, pumas, all the same. Big cat, of course, great cat. Do they have it's I-15, is it? Do I remember that right? Is
yes,
I-15? Yes. Is what really cuts their movement. Is there a safe crossing on I-15 for cougars now, or when might there be?
No, not at all. I think there's more and more conversation, but it's been talked about for 20 years now. But there's more and more talk. The Nature Conservancy finally got on board and has purchased property on one side of the freeway. The city of Temecula has property on the other side. And the Pechanga Indians have also acquired property. And Pechanga Indians amazingly, wonderfully stepped up to the plate and bought a vital piece of property that was slated to be strip mined. They bought it at a very significant price from the mining company, which very, very inspirational to see, where not another conservation group or the county or the state was going to go to, task with the mining company to buy it from them. But the Indians, no problem.
Good for them.
It was very inspiring.
That is. Is their land one of the places where a cougar crossing might go?
To have land on both sides of the freeway protected, it makes it much more possible that the state would recognize that as an appropriate. They wouldn't have to do much other than build a bridge, or either a tunnel under or a bridge over. And in this particular place right now, there are some small, not really tunnels, but
small underpasses.
Yeah, underpasses, but they're more like drainage ditches that are able to be utilized.
Yeah.
But a bridge is now more viable. It's been done in other parts of the country and certainly in Canada. So that is likely going to come to pass, hopefully sooner than later. I'm hoping in the next 5 years we'd see that.
So I suppose the obstacles, supposed lack of money on the part of the transportation department, or well,
not lack of money, but lack of intention to do. California is not very progressive with how they spend their money for transportation issues. Very little public transportation that tends to just broaden freeways. Yeah. And so there's funds there, but it's not appropriated, I think, in a way that we'd like to see it.
Right. So I got you onto the cougar path quite appropriately, or actually you went on that without my provocation, but I do want to let you say a little more about what Eddy Foundation is doing to help protect Santa Margarita River Wildway. I've had the pleasure of hiking many times there with Jamie, and we have seen fresh puma tracks, cougar tracks, several times in the sand along the river. Always thrilling. What is Eddy Foundation doing to help protect the Wildway?
So I think it's important to see there are a lot of really good conservation groups in Southern California, in San Diego County in particular. I think it's as much for those groups to focus on common goals and work together to achieve that. And so I certainly have been, as much as possible, entering conversations and bringing other people together to talk about how can we accomplish this. And one way we're doing it is not. We're bringing humans into the equation too. But let's have a human trail, that is parallel to the wildlife trail, and that seems to be appealing partly because there's an economic benefit to have people hiking through small communities and so on, and people enjoying and seeing a passageway. Mm-hmm. So that's one way that we're working together on trail systems, which I think is rather viable.
And that's partly with Fallbrook Land Conservancy.
It's Fallbrook Land Conservancy right now. We were fortunate enough to get a grant from the National Park Service to do map out a potential trail from. Really from the ocean, from the town of Oceanside to some of the backcountry around Temecula, and in that we got interested parties around a table together, and the city of Temecula was certainly one, and they have a very proactive town board, very conservation minded, and the Sierra Club and International Mountain Biking Association, the Fallbrook Land Conservancy, San Diego State University, and then other, actually the Wildlands Conservancy right now has just stepped up to the plate where we are, and they were able to buy the land that was slated to be flooded from the dam that had been not protected, and it was just sitting there, and it could have been developed, but they recently stepped up to the plate, and they have under contract, I think they paid like $10 million for it. So they're at the table with us now, working together. So what has Eddy done? Yeah, I think as much as anything, brought people together to talk about it, and we've been able to identify pieces of land that should be added to this linkage, this corridor that would act as a buffer or widen it to a degree.
Very inspiring.
Yeah,
wonderful area. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Wildlands Conservancy. Are they not now the largest private conservation landowner in the state of California?
Yes.
Yeah, that's impressive.
Yeah. Good people. They've done great work.
Yeah.
It's a privilege to work with them.
I think Tom Butler, I believe, has a chapter about their work in the Wildlands Philanthropy book. David Myers, is he the director?
Yeah, right.
Great people. And say a little, if you would, about Eddy Foundation's involvement in Dominican Republic forest conservation and the Bicknell's thrush, which I should note summers here in the Adirondack High Peaks, among other places.
Right. So I have to think back. That goes back a ways. Oh yeah, I'm recalling I was on the board of the Adirondack Council, another significant player here in the Adirondacks, and they got involved in mitigation funds that were set aside by DEC here, because DEC cleared for a ski slope Bicknell's thrush habitat.
On Whiteface Mountain, yep.
Okay, and Bicknell's thrush is I guess they're just a threatened species and endangered, but certainly habitat that needed to be mitigated. So they set aside funds for mitigation to buy land that would be suitable habitat to replace what they destroyed. But in looking at the Adirondack Mountains, there actually is a lot of suitable habitat that was already protected. And doing more research, it's like, but why is the bird in demise? And as it turns out, bigness thrush is a migrating bird, and it migrates in the winter down to a very small area in the Caribbean, to the Dominican Republic, mainly, and then also a little bit in Puerto Rico, a little bit in Cuba, but for the most part, Dominican Republic. And so I was interested in I was just actually inspired by the bird and looking at its corridor that it flew down, every winter. So I thought, gosh, maybe that would be a good place for us to explore as a piece of conservation land to help protect that effort to protect the bird. So, yeah, actually, John, you and I went down there early on in our exploration, and we had been working with the Nature Conservancy down there, but ended up working with a couple of kind of wildland philanthropists of the Dominican Republic. Their father, the Merinos, they have an ice cream franchise. They're like the Ben & Jerry's of the Dominican Republic. But their father started the first private reserve in Dominican Republic. And so we connected with them and identified some land that might indeed be bigness thrush habitat that we could invest in with them and inspire other conservationists down there to do a similar thing. And we felt we could work with the local community and buy a piece of degraded land and reforest it or work with the land so it could be protected as bignell thrush habitat, but at the same time give employment to the community. So we ended up buying 1,000 acres, and half of it was already forest land, some older trees, but all of it was in the process perhaps of being cleared for cow pasture. A lot of it had been, but we were able to buy it and work with the community and with a really good man who was very interested in chocolate. So as it turned out, as you plant shade-grown chocolate plantations, if you will, they're very friendly to bignell thrush habitat for bignell thrush habitation for winter, particularly the females. And so it's been a very inspiring thing. We've gotten a lot of chocolate to eat, which maybe that's the interest we've gotten for that investment.
So chocolate, ice cream, and a beautiful songbird. You can't
I know,
top
it's
that.
pretty hard to go wrong.
Jamie, you and I have both remarked through the years how we sometimes feel a little bit like the conservation gatherings around us, and we attend many here in the Adirondack Park and throughout the country, are largely peopled by folks our age and older. And nothing wrong with that. The senior citizens are some of our most important conservation leaders, and people 50 and older, as we are conservation leaders throughout the world, but we certainly want to see ourselves replaced by young generations of wilderness and wildlife proponents. I actually think we're seeing that more now than we were 10 years ago, and I'm encouraged to see young people in leadership positions at wilderness groups, and especially young women at leadership positions with conservation groups. Really good trend, I think. But say more, if you would, Jamie, about involving young people, working with young people, because you've always been really far-seeing on this issue, more than many of us.
One thing I look at, which is obvious to me, in a lot of the conservation groups, the land trusts and so on, they're run largely by their board of directors. And interestingly, the boards, from the way boards were years ago and still are to a degree, it's often people that have money are invited to be on boards. and or maybe accomplished scientists or people that have done well in business. Very few young people on boards, and I think that is something that needs to be addressed. That we don't necessarily have to have people on a board of directors that are accomplished people in whatever field, but I think people that young people especially, that have the potential for really applying their passions, even though they don't necessarily come from wealth or haven't accumulated wealth. I think just their energy and enthusiasm we need on those boards. I think as well, shifting a little bit, that has been a little bit controversial. A lot of people don't want mountain bikes on trails. One thing that we've learned, certainly in Southern California, is to share the trails. So a lot of the funding, certainly state funding for trails, and even the National Park Service, where they help fund for trails, it's multi-use. It is. We need to learn that people that ride horses are awesome. Sometimes very, very good conservationists. And yes, the horses can impact a trail. So can mountain bikes. And yet, I think that we can't alienate each other in the conservation community. We need to respect the values, even that hunters and fishermen have. Because there are many of us that are good conservationists. We don't need to alienate each other. But the youth, I think especially, let's accept that they do like to be a little more active on trails, and they're apt to. I think we look at moonlight hikes that we have sometimes, and something that I see popular and is interesting in California, where marijuana has been legalized. They have ganja yoga, that all the young people go to, and it's like yoga class, but they actually smoke pot, in a way just to focus on their yoga. That's very youthful. It's not old people doing that particularly. I think, even to allow, what's wrong with a ganja hike, and we would get young people also involved. That's not because of our older people's values. Let's realize young people have different values very often. So I think we need to broaden our perspective on who we include in our conservation community.
Well said. Now I want to take you to the other end of life, to death, and to your very exciting opening of a green cemetery, where I hope to be gravedigger. Spirit Sanctuary, you've named it, and you went through quite a bit of paperwork, quite a bit of time to get the permits needed to start a green cemetery here in the Eastern Adirondacks. And while we've not buried anybody there yet, we've dug a sample grave. I like to joke, I've dug my own grave. I dug it. And
I conveniently remind you, you did lose that grave.
Well,
I think there wasn't a very strong intention to be buried there.
It's covered up now, so I guess I'll have to dig my own grave yet again. But we're hoping, of course, to popularize the green burial movement and use it as a tool for land conservation. You were really way ahead of most of us, again, on this subject. So say something about why you spent a lot of time figuring out how to start a green cemetery and what we hope to do with it.
Well, in retrospect, it was actually a lot of fun. People in general, do not like to talk about death. And certainly cemeteries is not, to be a grave digger or a funeral director. Those are not occupations held in very high esteem generally. But I have to laugh at that because I think they are wonderful avenues to talk about and really transform our attitudes. I think that is, the funeral business. There are some really good funeral directors and funeral homes, if you will, but in general, that business has been corrupted to a large degree to where death has become big business for a lot of people, and it's something that is a difficult time in life, and it's gotten more so for people. And I think with what I was just looking for a place for me to be buried, I think, in a way that I could not imagine being, put in a barren lawn, landscaped place that was not friendly to, wasn't nice to go to. And the idea of cremation, it's like, right, we need to, use 30 gallons of propane to burn a body, to put a lot of pollution in the air, and it's something we just haven't paid much attention with climate change, climate chaos, if you will. We need to pay attention to what we're putting into the air, to what fossil fuels we're burning for what. It's a no-brainer for me. Of course, putting a body in the ground is a natural way to help a landscape, to revitalize the soil. I love the idea of being buried in a place and a tree planted over my grave, and feel I'm totally a part of that landscape that I really came from.
So for those of us who have decided we indeed want to be buried at Spirit Sanctuary here in Splitrock Wildway, what do we do? How do we get in, besides dying?
Yeah, that's a prerequisite for sure. But no, actually, you can get in before you die. In fact, we encourage that. You get in by. We've tried to make it as economical as can be, and so we'd be. Eddy Foundation was able to contribute the land for the cemetery, which I think every land trust should be involved in doing, and we have decided, let's just try and at least break even. We'll make a bit of money on this, so we're charging $1,000 to have the right to be buried there. But in addition to that, one has to, in their end-of-life plan, in their will or their trust, they need to include a conservation group in their estate planning. So when they die, at least in our conversation, if you're going to be buried at Spirit Sanctuary, let's think about conservation in general, and we have deliberately included as a prerequisite for being buried there that you do have to think about conservation and act on it in your end-of-life estate.
That's good. So we will actually, Eddy Foundation will actually charge, or Spirit Sanctuary will actually charge less money than a conventional burial, but with the understanding that the family of the loved one, departed loved one, will have, or that person, him or herself, will have committed to donate to a conservation group. And I think we're going to be working particularly with Northeast Wilderness Trust, Champlain Area Trails, and Adirondack Council, and the Rewilding Institute, and the Old Growth Forest Network, and a few others. But we're saying, correct me if I'm wrong, we're saying you can choose your conservation group, but here's a list of ones we especially recommend. Is that what we have in mind?
I think I would also turn it over to them to see what groups they have already worked with that they would be inspired to work with. Certainly, if anybody's lacking suggestions, those that you mentioned would be very appropriate. I think that is also a wonderful way for other land trusts to acquire land, and maybe still you can double the price of what we charge. And I think though that we've looked at it, more of a typical charge is like $3,500. So if one has not already included a conservation group, and they still, if someone dies, the family wants them to be buried at Spirit Sanctuary, it will cost $3,500.
If they've not.
If they haven't already included a conservation group in their will. And that's more in line with what other green cemeteries charge, and very often green cemeteries are using those funds to acquire more conservation land. So indeed, if somebody pays $3,500 to Spirit Sanctuary, likely that will go to expand the cemetery, and our cemetery is beautiful. I mean, it's a recovering pasture land that will become a clay plain forest again, as it would turn out. And so I think it's important that we realize it is a great tool for other conservation groups to buy and protect more wildlands.
Yes, absolutely. And by the time this podcast airs, we probably will have run in Rewilding Earth an article about green cemeteries focusing largely on Spirit Sanctuary. So by the time you're hearing this, listeners, if you go to rewilding.org, you'll probably find an article about the Green Cemetery movement and about Spirit Sanctuary. Thank you for the special conversation and the pileated woodpecker in our background and the other birds. And please, folks, keep following our Wildways and their Champions podcast series, and also please keep reading Rewilding Earth, which, as always, is up at rewilding.org. And we thank our sponsors in particular. So long for now.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Be sure to visit rewilding.org to subscribe so you don't miss past and future episodes. And while you're there, please consider supporting Rewilding by making a donation or subscribing to the Rewilding Earth newsletter.